When a young child collapsed on that scorching afternoon, the first words from her foster mother sent a ripple of unease through everyone who heard them. What appeared to be an unfortunate case of heat exhaustion soon spiraled into something far more disturbing, peeling back layer after layer of deception. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and if you believe the truth should always come to light, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that demand our attention. The day seemed ordinary at first, marked by the haze of late summer sun and the loud chatter of children freed from their classrooms. School staff had seen hot days before, days where the grass lay baked to a brittle golden hue and every outdoor bench scorched eager hands. But the atmosphere held an extra edge of discomfort, as though something was off balance. Teachers had hustled their students outside for a brief gym session, warning everyone to keep hydrated. Yet within minutes, Emily Martin, a small 9-year-old foster child with a timid smile, wavered on her feet before collapsing hard onto the ground. Her face went sheet white, and her eyes stared wide at nothing in particular. Several adults rushed over. They suspected heatstroke at first, or dehydration at the very least. She was so small, so quiet, barely a presence in the classroom some days. She didn't respond to frantic questions, not even a flicker of recognition. While the school nurse insisted on immediate hospitalization, the rest of the staff exchanged anxious glances. They had never seen Emily fade away like that. Yes, she was shy, and yes, she struggled at times to keep up in gym class. But her sudden lifelessness seemed to hint at something beyond the merciless sun. Emily was whisked to the hospital in an ambulance with lights glaring against the searing sky. By the time Dr. Lena Morris arrived on shift, she encountered the worried cluster of teachers in the waiting area. The tension thickened as word spread that Emily still hadn't regained consciousness. Blood tests and scans were expedited. Dehydration might make sense on the surface, but her body's signs, particularly her slowed heart rate, were not consistent with any typical heat-related illness in a child of her age. Dr. Morris, who had spent enough years in the pediatric ER to know when a case required closer scrutiny, couldn't ignore her growing suspicion that something else was very wrong. When a woman named Marianne Cray strode into the hospital corridor, her expression calm and collected, the staff assumed she was just an unusually composed foster mother. Marianne listened attentively to the updates, explaining with an almost clinical detachment that Emily was on new medication for anxiety and must have had a negative reaction to the heat. It struck Dr. Morris as peculiar that a child of 9 would be on such powerful medication. At least, that was how Marianne described it. Dr. Morris gently pressed for details. Dosage, name, prescribing physician. Marianne responded vaguely, claiming she didn't recall specifics. She only mentioned that Emily's anxiety had been severe enough to warrant stronger meds, so perhaps that explained this extreme reaction. Still, Dr. Morris felt a simmering unease. The hospital started running comprehensive toxicology screens. When the results came in, they revealed an elevated concentration of a sedative not typically prescribed to children at all. In fact, it was more commonly used in adults with severe insomnia, or even in some preoperative sedation protocols. Just seeing the drug's name on the lab printout made Dr. Morris's stomach knot in dismay. Marianne's earlier insistence that Emily was on medication specifically for anxiety unraveled right away. The compound identified in Emily's bloodstream was nowhere near standard pediatric care. Even the staff nurse who assisted Dr. Morris that evening raised an eyebrow. Dr. Morris confronted Marianne gently but firmly, hoping perhaps there was some mix-up of prescriptions. Yet Marianne's composure didn't crack. She repeated a story about an out-of-state doctor, missing paperwork, switched clinics. The more she spoke, the more contradictory it all sounded. It wasn't Dr. Morris's first time dealing with suspicious circumstances surrounding a child's medical condition. She had seen everything from parents refusing blood transfusions based on obscure beliefs to neglect cases that bordered on criminal. But something about the cold logic in Marianne's voice, the unwavering calm when confronted with evidence, raised the hairs on the back of Dr. Morris's neck. The woman had a way of speaking that offered carefully measured words, all the while revealing nothing. Dr. Morris resolved to make more calls, to local pharmacies, neighboring states' prescription databases, anywhere she could find a paper trail for the sedative discovered in Emily's system. There was none. Child Protective Services, CPS, got involved promptly, spurred by the hospital's mandatory reporting guidelines. Dr. Morris provided them with the test results, plus the contradictory statements from Marianne. Soon enough, an investigation took shape, and within days, the horrors hidden behind Marianne's veneer began to surface. The revelation that Emily had been just one of several children who passed through Marianne's care in recent years, each with suspiciously short stays and minimal follow-up, painted a harrowing picture. One fact caught Dr. Morris's attention. Every single child who left Marianne's home did so in a condition described as subdued, manageable, quiet. These were kids once labeled difficult, unruly, or traumatized, many of them older foster children who needed specialized therapy or close support. Yet reports from teachers, caseworkers, or neighbors after a few months in Marianne's home referred to them as if they'd been transformed into polite, compliant shadows of their former selves. At first glance, one might applaud Marianne's supposed ability to create a stable environment where troublemaking children were taught discipline. But Dr. Morris saw that something more insidious might be happening behind closed doors. Emily remained in the hospital for days, drifting in and out of a sedated haze. Her body was metabolizing the drug, but it wasn't an easy process. Dr. Morris visited her every chance she got, speaking to the child even if Emily only sometimes opened her eyes, as though glimpsing the world through a fog. A whispered word here, a brief attempt to speak there. She seemed to cling to Dr. Morris's presence more than anyone else's. And Dr. Morris realized she was growing personally invested in Emily's fate in a way that went beyond professional duty. As the investigation grew deeper, the shock waves rattled through the county's foster care system. An unspoken question seemed to leap from one set of wide eyes to another. How had no one noticed? How had Marianne managed to keep this pattern hidden, child after child, for 3 years? Part of the answer emerged when an investigator uncovered Marianne's past employment at a group home in another state. The facility had been shuttered due to allegations of sedation-based behavioral control. Yet Marianne had never been officially charged. She simply disappeared after the place closed, re-emerging here with a new career path as a foster mother specializing in challenging cases. To the social workers, she had been a valuable asset, someone who was always willing to take on children that others refused. When authorities searched Marianne's home, they found a locked cabinet in her bedroom closet. Inside were pill bottles, none labeled with names matching any occupant of the household. Analysis showed that at least one of the bottles was indeed the same drug detected in Emily's system. Tucked next to the bottles was a small spiral notebook labeled adjustment logs. The notes inside contained daily entries of dosage amounts, times, and subsequent behavioral observations. One line read, "Inspection tomorrow. Reduce dosage by 40% to avoid visible fatigue." The more the investigators dug, the more horrifying the evidence became. For Dr. Morris, the days that followed were a tangle of heartbreak and determination. She found herself in the odd position of not just being Emily's doctor, but also stepping into the role of advocate. Maybe it was the child's vulnerability, her wide, frightened eyes whenever she stirred in the hospital bed, or the quiet pleas Dr. Morris had begun to notice whenever Emily roused enough to grip her hand. Emily's drawings, once she was coherent enough to pick up crayons, portrayed a disturbing reality. She drew a small stick figure girl asleep in a bed, a tall figure looming beside her with a spoon or a cup pressed to the girl's lips. Another drawing depicted a windowless room, the walls thick with scribbled numbers. Her portrayal of Marianne was a woman with a fixed smile, her face shaped almost like a mask. Emily's fear reached beyond the immediate trauma. It was as if she was waiting for some retribution to strike if she spoke. Dr. Morris recognized that kind of cautiousness. She had seen it in children who'd endured repeated abuse or who had learned that speaking up only brought worse punishments. Step by step, Dr. Morris's own nights began to fill with restless questions. Even as the hospital quieted for the evening and the fluorescent lights dimmed in the corridors, Dr. Morris found herself lingering by Emily's side, reading her stories, or just holding her small hand until the child drifted off to a more peaceful sleep. Meanwhile, CPS encountered an ever-widening tangle of lies. They learned that Marianne had officially fostered 5 children over the past 3 years, each case culminating in one abrupt transition after another. One was supposedly reunited with a paternal aunt, but no documentation or official records existed to confirm that. Another child was said to have been adopted out of state, though no adoption agency in the region recalled the child's name. A third had apparently run away, but no missing persons report had ever been filed, and no official follow-up occurred in the system. The deeper the investigators probed, the more they saw how meticulously Marianne had orchestrated a story for each child, ensuring they vanished from her life without leaving a visible thread that might lead back to her methods. When news of Marianne's arrest spread, it made headlines. The media latched onto the sensational details, the horrifying notion of a foster parent systematically drugging the children in her care. Politicians and child welfare advocates expressed outrage, demanding reforms. But beyond the spotlight, the lasting damage to the children who had passed through Marianne's home weighed heavily on Dr. Morris's mind. She wondered about those she might never be able to help, kids whose fates had been sealed by a manipulative woman. In Emily, Dr. Morris saw a chance to do more than just observe from a distance. Perhaps it was a naive hope, perhaps it was the maternal instinct that had been growing in her year after year. Or maybe it was the heartbreak that accompanied the memory of children she had not been able to save in the past. That was how Dr. Morris found herself filling out petition after petition, speaking tirelessly with social workers, expressing in official language her desire to assume guardianship of Emily. Initially, she encountered resistance. The rules surrounding foster placements and adoptions were intricate. A child's caretaker needed to demonstrate suitability, pass background checks, endure home visits. While Dr. Morris's professional credentials were certainly above reproach, stepping over that boundary from doctor to guardian was a challenging matter. She braced herself for a grueling process, determined to see it through. Emily, for her part, seemed to bond with Dr. Morris. It was a slow, tentative process, marked by shy glances and gestures rather than words. She was used to being subdued, to the sense that her voice might cause trouble. But she started to trust Dr. Morris enough to smile when she visited the hospital room or to lean her head against Dr. Morris's shoulder when her nightmares threatened to surface. Marianne's trial was swift once the evidence stacked up. The photographic documentation from her logs, the unmarked pills, the suspicious circumstances surrounding the disappearance of previous foster children, all of it painted a damning picture. She was charged with child endangerment, unlawful administration of a controlled substance, falsifying foster care records, and a litany of other crimes. While the newspapers clamored for more details, the county officials took the opportunity to launch a comprehensive review of high-turnover foster care placements statewide. It was a massive undertaking with the hope that it might uncover other potential abusers lurking in the system. From that point, Dr. Morris only grew more involved, working with a detective named James Carmichael, who had been assigned to lead the investigation into the missing foster children from Marianne's home. He was a patient man in his late 40s, with the kind of rumpled suit that indicated countless late nights spent poring over files. He told Dr. Morris that they had reason to believe at least 2 of the children once in Marianne's care had ended up in extremely precarious circumstances. One tip suggested a child might have been illegally trafficked. Another lead implied that some children might have been passed off to unscrupulous individuals, though no direct evidence surfaced at first. As Emily gradually recovered and gained the strength to speak, Dr. Morris carefully asked gentle questions. It was a painfully delicate matter. Emily's memories were confused, a patchwork of sedation-induced haze. She remembered times when Marianne would offer her special juice before bed or when a spoonful of something bitter would be forced upon her. Over time, Dr. Morris collected enough pieces to create a mosaic of cruelty. The sedation was never an accident, never a misguided attempt to treat genuine anxiety. It was a tool Marianne used to create docile children, easy to handle, easy to move on. Emily had no idea where the other foster children had gone, only that they would suddenly vanish after 1 or 2 nights of even heavier sedation. In the wake of everything, Dr. Morris found herself in the center of a moral storm. The hospital wanted to maintain a level of detachment to ensure that no staff member overstepped professional roles. But Dr. Morris was unwavering in her determination to protect Emily. She explained to her superiors that it was within her rights as a concerned citizen and a human being to seek legal guardianship, separate from her role as a physician. The bureaucratic wheels turned slowly, but eventually, an official hearing was set. Carmichael assisted in providing a thorough background check on Dr. Morris so the process could move along. He asked her politely if she had the stamina to fight for a traumatized child who might struggle for years with trust, nightmares, and anxiety. Dr. Morris's face was resolute. She had no illusions about the difficulties. She had seen enough abused children to know that the scars ran deep. And yet, every day she spent with Emily, seeing the child's eyes open a little wider in cautious hope, the sense of purpose in Dr. Morris's chest only grew stronger. If she did not step up now, she wondered, who else would? The guardianship hearing arrived with little fanfare. Emily, who had only recently been released from the hospital into temporary foster care, clung to Dr. Morris's side. She wore a simple dress and clutched a small plush dog in her arms. Marianne wasn't there. She remained in custody, awaiting trial. The few people present in the modest county courtroom included a social worker, a court-appointed advocate for Emily, and a handful of curious onlookers. Dr. Morris's heart pounded as she took the stand to explain why she was seeking guardianship. She spoke about Emily's vulnerability, her medical condition, and the bond they had formed. She confessed she had wrestled with the potential conflict of interest but maintained that her only interest was Emily's well-being. It took a short hour of testimony, but it felt like days. In the end, the judge approved emergency guardianship for Dr. Morris with a stipulation that a follow-up hearing would be required in 6 months to ensure it was indeed the right fit. Emily, for the first time in what felt like an eternity of turmoil, had a stable home. Dr. Morris promised the judge she would provide the environment Emily needed to heal. Even so, the look in Emily's eyes when they left the courtroom was uncertain. Children who have been deceived and hurt so thoroughly learn not to trust easily, even when rescue arrives. Still, each day at Dr. Morris's house opened a new chapter in Emily's life. She had her own room, painted a soothing pale yellow. There were fresh sheets, fluffy pillows, and no locked cabinets. The windows let in sunlight every morning, and Dr. Morris took the time to point out the birds perched on the backyard fence, the way the neighborhood cat prowled along the hedges. Emily explored the space timidly, as if testing whether it might all vanish if she looked too closely. Dr. Morris's friends and neighbors offered words of support, some bringing over clothes, toys, or children's books. Others tiptoed around the topic, unsure how to deal with the gravity of Emily's trauma. A friend of Dr. Morris, a nurse named Carla Watson, visited often to check on the little girl. Carla had a gentle manner of speaking, using softened jokes and sweet anecdotes to coax a smile from Emily. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. In the evenings, Dr. Morris spent time reading to Emily, choosing light-hearted stories about curious animals or adventurous kids. She avoided anything that hinted at cruelty or sedation, wanting to foster a sense of safety. Emily listened intently, though her grip on the quilt or her stuffed dog might tighten whenever a scene involved tension or peril. Dr. Morris learned to read Emily's body language, pausing to reassure her whenever fear flickered across her young face. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Marianne progressed. Evidence continued to mount, and new leads trickled in about the other children. Detective Carmichael confided in Dr. Morris that they were on the verge of identifying one of the missing kids in a neighboring county. The child had ended up in a dubious situation, though the details were murky. Dr. Morris wondered if Emily might one day remember more details that could guide investigators to the others. But the stress took its toll on Dr. Morris. She struggled to balance her demanding shifts at the hospital with the new responsibilities of caring for a deeply traumatized child. She woke earlier to prepare Emily's breakfast, to make sure she felt calm about the day's routine. She scheduled therapy sessions with a trusted child psychologist who specialized in foster children and abuse survivors. In her quieter moments, Dr. Morris questioned her ability to handle it all. She feared letting Emily down, feared that a single misstep might rekindle the child's nightmares. Perhaps the biggest challenge was Emily's ongoing anxiety attacks. The sedation had left a terrible imprint on her. Sometimes, she would awaken in the middle of the night, convinced she needed to swallow the medicine. She would cry, trembling, because Marianne had ingrained in her that refusing the spoon or cup was not an option. Dr. Morris would hold her close, whispering promises that no one would force her to take anything ever again. Emily would cling to Dr. Morris, her small fingers digging into the fabric of Dr. Morris's t-shirt, as if terrified the woman might vanish if she let go. Months passed like this, a delicate dance of healing and fear. The CPS check-ins were frequent, and Dr. Morris often felt like she was living under a microscope. Yet she understood the necessity. After all, the system had failed Emily once by placing her with Marianne. Now it had to ensure it wouldn't fail her again. Dr. Morris worked to prove that Emily was indeed in a supportive home. The therapy appointments, school updates, and daily life all began to show incremental improvements. Emily started speaking more openly about her experiences. She even asked Dr. Morris if she could sign up for a simple art class at the local community center, a surprising request that hinted she was ready to interact with the world again. Despite these positive strides, the looming specter of Marianne and what she represented lingered over them. The trial date crept closer, and Dr. Morris received subpoenas to testify both as a medical professional and as Emily's guardian. She dreaded the thought of facing Marianne in court. And yet, she welcomed the chance to expose the woman's cruelty and support justice for all the children who had been harmed. Emily, for her part, seemed to wither at the mention of Marianne's name. She retreated into silence, her eyes haunted by memories no child should have. Dr. Morris and Emily's therapist decided that Emily wouldn't be required to testify in a conventional sense. She was simply too fragile. Instead, her words would be presented through recorded interviews or compiled in a child-sensitive manner. Nonetheless, the tension weighed on them both. As the trial finally began, the county courthouse buzzed with journalists. Public outrage had grown as more details surfaced. Marianne arrived each day looking oddly unperturbed, her eyes devoid of empathy. She had acquired a lawyer who argued vehemently that all evidence was circumstantial, that Marianne had been misunderstood, that the children's sedation might have been the result of improperly labeled medicine. But the logs she had kept were damning, as were the results from the pill bottles found in her home. Witness after witness testified, social workers who described the missing children, teachers who noticed Emily's sudden shift from shy but active child to a ghost-like figure. Dr. Morris took the stand on the third day, explaining the medical impossibility of the sedation having come from any legitimate pediatric prescription, describing Emily's condition upon arrival at the hospital. She recounted the toxicology results in detail, outlining how it aligned perfectly with the pills discovered in Marianne's cabinet. Under cross-examination, Marianne's lawyer tried to poke holes in the timeline, suggesting that Dr. Morris's involvement blurred professional boundaries. Dr. Morris held her ground. She refused to be baited into anger, calmly explaining that she had acted out of necessity to protect a vulnerable patient. That was her oath as a doctor, and it was also her duty as a human being. During those tense days, Emily stayed with Carla, who had generously offered to keep watch whenever Dr. Morris had to be at the courthouse. The child spent her time drawing pictures of houses with flowers outside, pictures of Dr. Morris wearing a long coat, her face rendered with kind eyes. Carla reported that Emily asked often if Dr. Morris was safe, if Marianne would be locked away forever. It pained Dr. Morris to realize how deeply Emily feared that Marianne's malice could still reach her. Finally, after weeks of testimonies, evidence reviews, and emotional statements, the jury delivered their verdict. Marianne was found guilty on multiple counts: child endangerment, criminal neglect, unlawful drug administration. There was talk of additional charges related to the fates of the other foster children, though specifics were still under ongoing investigation. The sentencing date was scheduled for a month later, but the sense in the courtroom was that Marianne would face a lengthy prison term. By then, the national media had turned the story into a rallying cry for foster care reform. Government officials pledged new safeguards, tighter regulation on high-turnover foster households, and improved cross-state record sharing to prevent someone like Marianne from exploiting the system again. Dr. Morris received calls from families who had adopted through the system, thanking her for shining a light on a vulnerability that had gone unnoticed for too long. She also heard from other medical professionals, social workers, and even some parents who admitted that they had suspected something was amiss with Marianne but had no way to prove it. When Dr. Morris returned home on the evening the verdict was read, she found Emily curled on the living room sofa, her stuffed dog nestled under her arm. The television was off, and Carla sat on a nearby chair, holding a crocheted blanket. Emily looked up at Dr. Morris with the wide, serious eyes of a child who had learned too many harsh lessons about the world. Dr. Morris knelt down beside the sofa and gently took Emily's hand. "It's over," Dr. Morris said softly. "Marianne is going away. She won't hurt anyone anymore." Emily's lips trembled, but she didn't speak. Instead, she threw her arms around Dr. Morris in a gesture so sudden that the older woman almost lost her balance. She caught Emily up in a tight embrace, tears stinging her own eyes. At that moment, every sleepless night, every agonizing day in the hospital, every frustrating turn of the investigation felt worth it. Carla smiled, dabbing at her own eyes, and quietly slipped out of the living room to give them space. The sentencing was predictable in its severity. Marianne showed little remorse, her impassive stare capturing headlines as though she still believed she had done nothing wrong. She received a long prison term, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions about the children who had vanished from her home. Detective Carmichael continued his search for them, and Dr. Morris offered her help wherever possible, though she knew the process would be slow and painful. In the months that followed, Emily stayed with Dr. Morris under the continued guardianship arrangement. The 6-month review approached, and Dr. Morris prepared anxiously for it. She worried about every detail, from the state of her home to the emotional progress Emily had made. She had grown to love Emily dearly. A small, fierce part of her refused to imagine the heartbreak if the court decided Emily should be placed elsewhere. But she told herself that no matter the outcome, she would always fight for Emily's right to feel safe and loved. The day of the hearing arrived on a bright morning. Emily dressed in a pale blue sweater, something she had picked out herself. She clung to Dr. Morris's hand as they entered the courthouse. Several social workers, a court-appointed child advocate, and Carla came to show support. Detective Carmichael was there as well, nodding at Dr. Morris with a respectful half-smile. Over the course of 3 hours, the judge reviewed updates from therapists and social services, listened to Dr. Morris's heartfelt explanation of the bond she had developed with Emily, and noted the improvements in Emily's emotional well-being. There were a few hiccups. Emily still struggled with night terrors, trust issues, and difficulties interacting with peers. Yet the progress was undeniable. At one point, Emily was given an opportunity to speak, if she wished, to tell the judge how she felt. She stood up from her seat with trembling knees, glancing at Dr. Morris for reassurance. "Can I stay with her?" Emily asked softly. Her voice echoed in the hushed courtroom. She didn't say much else. She didn't need to. That single question, accompanied by the pleading look in her eyes, weighed more than 1,000 pages of reports. The judge carefully considered everything before rendering a final decision. When at last he announced that Emily could remain with Dr. Morris under permanent adoption procedures, Dr. Morris exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Emily threw her arms around Dr. Morris's waist right there in the courtroom, and applause broke out among the small gathering of supporters. Life settled into a delicate but hopeful rhythm after that. Emily learned to find joy in simple things, painting watercolors in the backyard, tossing a squeaky ball to Biscuit, the small rescue dog Dr. Morris adopted for her. Biscuit proved to be a patient companion, seemingly aware that Emily needed gentle acceptance. The child's laughter, at first seldom heard, began to ring through the house more frequently. Sometimes, if a door slammed too loudly or a sudden noise startled her, Emily would flinch, her eyes darting with residual fear. Dr. Morris would comfort her, reminding her that no one would force medication down her throat again. Over time, Emily believed it. Dr. Morris's personal life changed as well. She found herself forging deeper connections with people who admired her dedication. Neighbors dropped by with kind words, and the once busy doctor learned how to slow down enough to enjoy a weekend pancake breakfast with Emily. Each new step was a victory over the ghosts of sedation that once haunted Emily's dreams. Occasionally, Dr. Morris and Emily would talk about the trial and Marianne. Emily wanted to know why Marianne did what she did, why she kept all those notes and pills, why she made the children sleepy all the time. Dr. Morris explained it in the gentlest terms possible, describing how some adults tried to control children in harmful ways, though no one deserved that. It was a conversation that recurred as Emily grew older, each time gaining new context and understanding. Dr. Morris never lied to her. She believed Emily had been lied to enough for one lifetime. Detective Carmichael stayed in touch. He called occasionally with updates about the other children, though many leads turned into dead ends. A couple of Marianne's previous fosters were identified in different states, placed with other families, and seemed physically well, if still emotionally scarred. A few were still missing. Each partial success filled Dr. Morris with relief, but the incomplete outcomes cast a shadow. She knew that not every child would be lucky enough to escape a brutal caretaker and find a champion willing to fight for them. The media fervor died down eventually, replaced by new headlines. But the legacy of the scandal left an impact on the foster care system. Funds were allocated for better oversight, for thorough background checks, for a specialized task force that would handle repeated foster turnovers. Dr. Morris participated in some of those reforms, offering her perspective as both a doctor and adoptive mother to a child who had been wronged by the system. She sat on panels, contributed to new guidelines that aimed to ensure no other caretaker could exploit vulnerabilities the way Marianne had. As years passed, Emily blossomed in the stable environment Dr. Morris provided. Her interests expanded beyond art. She discovered a passion for reading, devouring novels well above her grade level. She joined a small volunteer group that helped care for stray animals, forging a gentleness and empathy that spoke volumes about her resilience. While she still carried the memories of the sedation, she refused to let them dictate her future. Therapy sessions became less frequent, then turned into occasional check-ins. Eventually, after a few years, Dr. Morris and Emily attended the final hearing that sealed Emily's official adoption. There was no real question about it at that point. The bond they shared was unbreakable. The judge congratulated them with a smile, and a formal certificate was signed. Emily was allowed to choose her new middle name, a small but symbolic act of empowerment. She picked Hope, explaining that it was what she had felt whenever Dr. Morris entered her hospital room. That night, they celebrated with a quiet dinner at home. Carla joined them, bringing a small cake topped with, "Welcome home, Emily." Detective Carmichael dropped by with an oversized teddy bear, awkwardly explaining that he wasn't much good at choosing gifts for kids but hoped this would make her smile. Emily grinned, hugging the bear and then hugging the detective, who stood stiffly for a moment before patting her shoulder. It was a moment of warmth that seemed almost surreal compared to the chaos of the past. As time flowed on, Dr. Morris watched Emily grow into a spirited teenager with bright eyes and an unquenchable desire to learn. By the time she reached high school, Emily was speaking out on issues of child welfare. She joined the debate club, finding in herself a voice that refused to remain silent. The heartbreak that once weighed her down became a catalyst for empathy. She even volunteered at local foster care events, standing at the edges, shyly giving encouragement to younger kids who faced the same confusion and fear she had once endured. Some nights, though, Emily still woke up in a cold sweat, the old terror creeping in. Dr. Morris would comfort her, reminding her that the locked cabinet and the forced sedation were distant nightmares. The real world might still harbor people like Marianne, but Emily was not alone. She had an ally, a family, and a future that no one could take from her. And Emily, leaning on Dr. Morris, recognized that her once silenced voice could no longer be stifled. Through this journey, Dr. Morris herself transformed. She discovered a capacity for love and perseverance beyond her previous imagination. Caring for Emily forced her to reevaluate her own life, her priorities, and how she spent her time. Work remained important, but no longer her sole focus. She made space for laughter, for lazy Sunday afternoons, for spontaneous trips to the library where Emily would scour the shelves for new authors. They would return home with a pile of books, brew some tea, and spend quiet hours together in companionable silence. On the broader scale, Marianne's actions had pulled the curtain back on a grotesque failure in the system, forcing reforms. The unwavering effort of Dr. Morris, Detective Carmichael, Carla, and many others led to tightened regulations on foster placements. Social workers received better training to detect signs of sedation or abuse, and there was a push to reduce the backlog that left kids languishing without proper oversight. While one case couldn't cure all the ills of foster care, it was a spark that lit more than a few changes. Emily sometimes asked Dr. Morris if they would ever know what happened to all of Marianne's lost fosters. Dr. Morris admitted she wasn't sure. Not all answers surface, even in the most diligent investigations. Some children might have changed their names or drifted from the system entirely. Others might still live under the shadow of that horrible time, never quite able to articulate what had been done to them. Emily would bow her head in sympathy whenever those thoughts arose. Yet she refused to let despair rule her. She told Dr. Morris that every day she chose to do good was a day that stood against Marianne's cruelty. And so their life continued, not perfect, but stitched together with threads of hope and healing. Emily's nightmares receded in frequency, replaced by new dreams. She wanted to travel one day, to see places beyond the small city that had once been her entire world of fear. She wanted to work with children who had faced trauma, paying forward the compassion she herself had received. At times, Dr. Morris would catch herself in tears of pride at how far Emily had come. Their story spread quietly, mostly through word of mouth, among pediatric wards and foster care circles. Dr. Morris found herself invited to speak at conferences about recognizing signs of medical child abuse. She always began her presentations by mentioning Emily, without revealing personal details, explaining how she nearly missed the subtle signals that something more sinister lay beneath a simple diagnosis. She would see nods in the audience, healthcare professionals determined to keep their eyes open, determined never to let a child slip through the cracks again. Though Marianne's case might have been a single dark stain on the foster care system, it was enough to awaken many. Public and private organizations donated resources to child protection agencies. Grants were set up to fund advanced training. Even the local police department formed a specialized unit, ensuring each reported instance of suspected abuse would be handled with the seriousness it deserved. Carmichael led that unit for a time, bringing his methodical patience and unwavering dedication to each new case. He never forgot Emily's small, brave face clinging to Dr. Morris in the courtroom. Years rolled by. The day Emily stood in front of the mirror in a white graduation gown seemed surreal to Dr. Morris, who remembered the fragile, frightened child in the hospital. Emily was a young woman now, carrying an air of quiet confidence. She was heading to a nearby college, determined to study social work. Dr. Morris had never been so proud. Their small circle of friends, Carla, Detective Carmichael, some neighbors, gathered at a post-ceremony party to celebrate. Laughter filled the backyard, mingling with the smell of barbecue. Biscuit wandered around, tail wagging at every dropped morsel of food. When the sun set, Emily lit a sparkler, watching its glow in the twilight. She turned to Dr. Morris, her expression layered with gratitude. "I can't believe how far we've come," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. Dr. Morris wrapped an arm around her shoulders, matching her gaze as the sparkler's final sparks flickered away. "You had it in you all along," Dr. Morris replied. "I just gave you a place to feel safe." Emily smiled, hugging her fiercely. No sedation could smother this brightness in her eyes. She was free. And Dr. Morris realized she, too, had been liberated from a life lived behind professional detachment. Through Emily, she had found a deeper calling, to champion the silent voices that slip through the cracks. In the gentle hush of that summer evening, neither of them needed to speak another word. Their bond had been forged in pain and nurtured by love, a testament to how a single child's quiet struggle could change countless lives. Eventually, time marched forward as it always did. Emily moved into college housing, returning on weekends to visit Dr. Morris. They called each other frequently, discussing everything from coursework to new fosters in the system who might need a mentor. Emily took on volunteer roles, counseling younger kids who had tasted cruelty. On more than one occasion, she sat with them through group therapy, sharing pieces of her own journey without naming names. Those children, once fearful and withdrawn, listened intently. She had survived. That knowledge alone lifted them, if only a little. The final threads of Marianne's tale unraveled slowly. She lost every appeal she attempted from prison. Detective Carmichael closed the last open file regarding her known fosters some years later, though not all children were found. Those that were, he tried to connect with proper resources. It wasn't a fairy tale ending for all, but it was a step. When he told Dr. Morris the news, she nodded, a bittersweet sadness in her eyes. "We do what we can," she said. "And sometimes that has to be enough." Every so often, Dr. Morris and Emily would visit the old hospital where they first met, giving the staff an update on Emily's progress. Some of the nurses still remembered the terrified, sedated child who arrived that boiling summer day. Seeing her now, poised and articulate, they beamed with pride. For them, her story was a reminder that the healing arts were not just about diagnosing ailments, but also about advocating for those too frightened to speak for themselves. When Emily turned 21, Dr. Morris organized a small party at the house. Carla came, along with other close friends. Even Detective Carmichael dropped by after his shift, bearing a card filled with well wishes. Over cake, they joked about old times, about the serious detective reading bedtime stories during one of Dr. Morris's busy on-call weekends. Emily laughed so hard she nearly choked on her soda, tears of amusement shining in her eyes. At one point, Carla raised a toast, remarking on how life had changed since that fateful day. "We've seen a miracle in this house," she said, smiling at Emily. "And it taught us all a thing or two about hope." For a moment, they stood in silence, each remembering the tragedies that brought them together, the battles they had to fight to keep Emily safe. But in that warm, lamplit room, the distance they had traveled felt immeasurable. Eventually, as dusk settled outside, Emily walked into the backyard alone, gazing up at the stars. Dr. Morris found her there, arms folded over the railing of the deck. "You okay, kiddo?" she asked. Emily turned, nodding. "More than okay," she said. "I was just thinking about how thankful I am." "For what?" "For you," she answered simply. "For not giving up when everyone else seemed to." Dr. Morris draped an arm around Emily's shoulders, pulling her in gently. She didn't need to speak. Emily understood, leaning her head on Dr. Morris's shoulder. They stood like that for a while, the quiet hum of cicadas enveloping them, the night sky endless overhead. And so the story found its conclusion not in a grand, cinematic finale, but in the day-to-day reality of two souls who refused to remain strangers. Emily's future lay open before her, shaped by experiences that most kids never had to face, but also illuminated by the unwavering support she had finally found. Dr. Morris's life expanded beyond the sterile confines of hospital corridors, enriched by a daughter who taught her the true depth of compassion. A decade later, no one would look at Emily and guess the trauma she endured as a child. She carried herself with grace, a fierce advocate for reforming the foster care system, a beacon for those who felt lost or unheard. In interviews or conference panels, she spoke passionately about her past, though she never named Marianne directly. She focused on the bigger picture, on the desperate need for vigilant oversight, on the importance of truly listening to children who might not have the vocabulary to explain their suffering. Her audience often contained doctors, social workers, and everyday citizens. Some listened in tears. Others took frantic notes, determined to implement change in their own communities. When Emily finished, Dr. Morris, sometimes watching from the sidelines, would feel a swell of pride. Any heartbreak they had endured felt worth it, if it meant saving another child from the horrors of sedation and neglect. On quiet nights at home, whenever Emily visited during college breaks or holidays, they fell into old routines. They played with Biscuit, who had grown older and slower, though just as loyal. They cooked simple dinners, reminiscing about the early days when Emily barely spoke above a whisper. Dr. Morris would occasionally glance at Emily and see flashes of that small, frightened 9-year-old. But those flashes were now wrapped in the present glow of a young woman who had reclaimed her life. If there was ever a question whether the truth should come to light, Emily's life was the resounding answer. Absolutely, without fail. The truth, once forced into a locked cabinet, had broken free. And in its wake came accountability, reform, and a second chance at a real childhood. No one doubted that Marianne's actions had left permanent scars on every child she harmed, but at least some measure of justice had been served. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than the victims once had. Emily was a testament to the power of resilience and the immense influence that genuine care could have on a life once overshadowed by fear. To this day, Dr. Morris keeps a small shelf in her study with Emily's old drawings, the dark room with those scribbled numbers, the sad child in bed with a spoon pressed to her lips, and the final one, a sunny picture of Dr. Morris holding Emily's hand outside a house with bright flowers. Each picture reminds her of the path they walked together, from sedation and deceit to hope and liberation. Their story is one of betrayal, resilience, and the relentless fight for justice. A testament to how the quiet voice of a child, combined with the unwavering support of those who dare to listen, can shatter even the most insidious illusions. It asks us to remain vigilant, to protect the voiceless, and to champion the truth, no matter how deeply it's buried. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that remind us never to shy away from the truth.